next in our panel is Professor Stephen Nagi from International Christian University in Tokyo. Professor Nagi is with us here online, and his topic is Taiwan contingency and Japanese security, balancing strategic ambiguity, one China policy and supporting the status quo. So it's a continuation of this one China policy perspective. Professor Nagi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to speak on this topic. Thank you for the invitation. And again, following Professor Hosoya is always a very difficult task, but he's laid out on the table, I think, a wonderful way to understand Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific. And I think what's really, as a take-home message, I think, from his presentation is the distinct nature of Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision. And I think that his discussion really bridges upon my discussion today that focuses on Japan's engagement with Taiwan and China through three lenses. The first lens is engagement. The second lens is resilience. And the third lens is deterrence. And I think these are very useful terms to understand how Japan is thinking about both Taiwan and China to secure peace and stability within the region. Just to start, and I think it's useful for us to think about Japan's trade in the region. Last year, despite a record unfavorable ratings with China, Japan traded about $210 billion in trade. Let me say that again, $210 billion. Japan is wedded to the Chinese market in terms of its economic future. Decoupling with China is not a possibility. And this leads to Japan crafting a policy for both Taiwan and China that, again, focuses on engagement, resilience, and deterrence. What are some examples of engagement? Well, simple examples, of course, of the regional comprehensive economic partnership in which Japan and China and South Korea, as well as the ASEAN countries, Australia and New Zealand, work together to produce a low-value trade agreement to build shared norms about trade, and of course to embed China into a regional trade agreement. This continuation of a multilateral, multi-layered approach to engagement with China by the Japanese is something that is really critical for us to be thinking about how Japan is thinking about China. Secondly, we see ongoing negotiations between China, South Korea, and Japan on a trilateral free trade agreement. This again demonstrates Japan's engagement strategy with China. It's not a zero-sum approach, and I think this is really important take-home. And we even have Japan at least beginning the discussions about potentially including both Taiwan and China in the TPP-11. And again, I think this demonstrates Japan continue to engage with China. They understand the benefits of the relationship, but at the same time, they understand the risks. My assumption, once the COVID-19 pandemic is over and China opens up, we'll see increased cooperation on environmental, climate change, non-traditional security issues, and most likely education exchanges moving forward. So engagement is an important point in terms of understanding Japan's engagement with both Taiwan and China. The second is resilience. And here, I think geopolitical pressures, but also non-traditional security events such as the COVID-19 pandemic has really impressed upon our Japan, the importance of building resilience into the Japanese economy. And this is usually falling under the umbrella of economic security, but we've seen Japan put together concrete initiatives such as the Resilient Supply Chain Initiative between India, Japan, and Australia to create alternative supply chains in Southeast Asia and South Asia. Japan is also working bilaterally with India. They've also worked with Australia and the United States in terms of a financing project. And of course, in 2020, the Japanese adopted a budget in which was emphasizing not only reshoring Japanese businesses from the region, but selectively diversifying supply chains throughout the region. This is a critical distinction between decoupling and diversification, is that Japan sees no future without selective diversification of supply chains. This means thinking about building alternative production networks in Southeast Asia and South Asia so that Japan is building and making products closer to centers of consumption. At the same time, they understand that the Chinese market of maybe 300, 400 middle-class Chinese consumers are going to be critical to Japan's sustainable economic future. And that means building in China, by Chinese, for Chinese, with Japanese technologies. Of course, this is where Taiwan comes in terms of building resilience, in particular resilience in technology supply chains. The Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company produces critical technologies that go into our iPhones, our computers, cars, and of course, jet fighters and other military tools. There's great concern about technology supply chains and the potential weaponization of these supply chains by China. And this is where a Taiwan contingency would be extremely troublesome for Japan and other countries. So building resilience into the supply chains is very critical for Japan, and we see it investing unilaterally, bilaterally, and multilaterally with like-minded countries to ensure that supply chains and trade remain stable. The vehicles of investment, of course, are the Quad, but also trade agreements like the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership. My last point, just to be brief and disciplined with time, is deterrence. Here, Japan is continuing to strengthen its relationship with the United States. The United States remains a cornerstone to Japan's security, but it's also diversifying. And we see this with that cake looks good, Professor Hosoya. We see Japan diversifying with the reciprocal access agreement with Australia. One was signed with the UK just 2 weeks ago, but I expect reciprocal access agreements to increase in number in the coming years as Japan sees these as important layers of deterrence within the region. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, although it is a security agreement, is also an agreement that focuses on technology working groups. Those technology working groups are meant to provide some deterrence in the areas of AI, quantum computing, cybersecurity, and hypersonic missiles. And we're going to see continued development in these particular areas through the Quad, but also I foresee that Japan will plug into the AUKUS agreement, not in the nuclear submarine part, but in terms of participating in AI, quantum computing, cybersecurity cooperation, and even perhaps hypersonic missiles. Other aspects of deterrence, I think is Japan's investment in multilateral and multi-layered engagement in the region and outside the region. Here, Japan's engagement with Europe through the Japan-Europe Economic Partnership Agreement is a very good example of that. Linking Japan's interests to European interests really means that what happens to Japan, what happens in terms of Taiwan will matter to the European Union. That means that the European Union will need to engage within the region to help contribute to problem solving within the region. So in brief, I'd like to go back to my 3 main points. Useful tools to understand Japan's engagement and thinking about China and Taiwan are engagement, resilience, and deterrence. Japan does not have a zero-sum approach to China. It continues to use a one China policy to engage with both Taiwan and China. At the same time, it understands and is clearly articulating to both Taiwan and China that Japan supports the status quo. This is evidenced by Prime Minister Suga's visit with President Biden last year, where he explicitly stated that peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits is in Japan's interests. This was reiterated at the Quad meeting, at the G7 meeting, at the NATO meeting, and this will continue to be reiterated to the Chinese and the Taiwanese that Japan does not support unilateral independence by the Taiwanese, nor does it support forced reunification by Beijing. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.